Hello, and welcome to another episode of Talking Till Dawn. I'm Martin, and I'm joined by the King of Creep, Mr. Michael Whitehouse. How the heck are you, Mike?
I am splendid. I've seen a couple of people say the King of Creep to other people.
I stole it from someone. I've stole it from someone calling you.
Oh, right, okay.
No. Someone said it. Can't remember who it was, so I can't give them credit, but someone said it on YouTube somewhere in response to one of your videos, either on Talking Till Dawn or Ghastly Tales, and I thought, that's great, I'm stealing that for the next. I'm always struggling to think of a fun title to give you.
The problem is they're not actually referring to my stories and my audio adaptations. They're referring to just me being a bit creepy.
I like the ambiguity of that, so that's, yeah. No, you're not a creepy guy, Mike. You're not. Well, you've never been creepy to me anyway.
I hope not.
Some Me Too shit might come out. I don't know anything about that. I hope you listeners are all doing well too. This episode is going to be a wee bit shorter than most of our main episodes. We've got a full-length episode coming down the pipeline. We've just had a few kind of minor snags. It means it's probably not going to be out until early next month, I would expect.
It's been my fault, everybody.
It's alright. It's okay. Yeah, these things happen. I thought rather than skip a month, it might be a good opportunity to feature a case that perhaps isn't as big a topic as most of our usual subjects. So we wouldn't normally pick it for a main episode. Maybe doesn't quite fit into our now traditional run of mini episodes around Christmas, but it's still something that I find really interesting and would love to cover, so I thought this was a good opportunity to do that. It is actually, though, something that I think has some similarities to the Cash Landrum incident that we featured at the end of last year among the Christmas episodes. So tonight, we are going to be discussing an infamous Scottish UFO case known as the Robert Taylor incident, sometimes referred to as the Dechmont Woods incident. But before we get into that, Mike, we should take a moment to say a personal thank you to our new Patreon supporters. We opened our Patreon just a few weeks back to help us with our costs and hosting fees and such, and we've been really blown away by the amount of support.
Yeah, it's been lovely.
Yeah, it's great. We've given cheesy names to the two tiers because that's just how a pair of corny bastards like us roll.
That's the new name for the podcast, everyone. A pair of corny bastards.
If we have another spin-off, that's definitely got to be the name. Our new Nightbirds are Nick P. Thank you so much, Nick. Nicky DeLeon Martin. Fantastic, Nicky. Much appreciated. Stuart Ray. Cheers, Stuart. And Dan's, not sure if that's Dan's or Dan S, but we're very grateful nevertheless. At our Dawnstar tier, the higher of the two levels, which also gets some special bonus episodes into the bargain, we have been joined by Dawn Fault Brown, a long-time supporter of the show.
Good old Fault.
Yeah.
A legend.
Thanks again, Fault. Diane Rowley, thank you so much. Jeff Ashley, now I could be wrong, but I think Jeff is another convert from Ghastly Tales.
Yeah, Jeff always takes the time to leave lovely comments. Cheers, Jeff.
Nina S, very much appreciated, Nina, thank you. Ratchbox, cheers Ratchbox, we appreciate it. And last, but absolutely not least, Damien Byrne, who was one of several people who contacted us over the preceding months, pestering us to set up a Patreon. Thanks for the support, man.
Yeah, it's really lovely. If anyone else wants to contribute and join our little community on Patreon, that would be great, so please do, and the link to that will be in the description.
Awesome. So this episode is about something that allegedly took place in 1979, just outside Livingston in West Lothian, near Edinburgh. Pretty local to both Mike and myself. It's less than an hour's drive away. Now, I've only just now suggested this to Mike. No promises this is going to happen, but maybe it would be a cool thing for us to take a drive out there at some point in the near future, have a hunt around, try and find the exact site of the alleged encounter. It might make for maybe an interesting little bonus video for the Patreon folks. What do you think, Mike?
I would love to get involved in all that sort of shenanigans and then segue into a ghost hunt.
Come for the aliens, stay for the ghosts. So anyway, it's 10:30 a.m. on the morning of Friday, 9th of November 1979, and forestry worker Bob Taylor is driving from his home in Livingston to a section of newly planted forest on the edge of a small hill known as Dechmont Law, just a couple of miles outside of town. The reason for his visit was mundane in the extreme. His job that morning was to inspect a clearing in the woods and ensure that no sheep or cows from the neighbouring fields had wandered in to eat saplings and to check the fences and that kind of thing. So he parks his pickup on an access road not too far from the M8 motorway at Uphall Station. He calls his red setter Lara out of the car and sets off on a footpath into the woods. He rounds a corner on the path, entering into the clearing, and in the clearing, there's not much build-up here. He saw an unfamiliar object. And that's one of the things I find really interesting about this, because quite often with these stories there's a big long spiel, a big long build-up to it.
I felt the dread.
Yeah, no, it's like an ordinary day. There's nothing, the dog's not going ballistic, there's nothing at all. He just turns the corner and bam.
Fucking predator standing there.
Yeah. That's how it'll end for us, man. I know.
Absolutely. It's a good way to go.
Bob would later describe the object as 20 feet or 6 metres across, 12 feet or about 4 metres high, circular, dome-like, and either resting upon the floor of the clearing or possibly hovering just above it. The surface of the object was dark grey metal that appeared to have a rough sandpaper-like texture. Around the circumference of the dome, a narrow flange or rim protruded and encircled the whole object. Taylor described it as being like the brim of a hat. From this brim, and this is strange, rose a series of small protrusions pointing upwards from the brim, topped with what looked like tiny propellers. Like, you know, cup anemometers? You know the little anemometers that check wind speed, Mike?
Yeah.
Right? It's like that kind of size. Propellers about that kind of size all around it. Almost like comically small if you look at the artist's impressions. I mean, these were so small they appeared to have no sort of lifting function or anything like that. The object was completely silent, but a strong acrid smell like burning brakes filled the clearing. Both Bob and Lara stood transfixed, just staring at this unexpected visitor. And then things got even more bizarre. 2 smaller spiked spheres that Bob described as resembling sea mines rolled across the ground towards him, seemingly under their own power. They were about 3 feet in diameter, and they bounced and rolled towards him across the floor of the clearing. These spheres attached themselves to Bob's legs, ripping the fabric of his trousers.
They attached themselves to Bob's balls.
Well, I mean...
They've replaced Bob's balls.
At the same time, a loud hissing sound pealed out around him, and the acrid burning rubber smell grew suffocatingly strong. Bob passed out of consciousness just as he heard a whistling whooshing sound, like the sound of a golf club or something swinging through the air, like a whoosh. And in a tragically wasted opportunity, he never seems to have used the phrase, "I was grabbed by the balls," when describing this. These balls came over and grabbed him. Very disappointing.
Yeah.
It was a huge thing with a big round dome, a very dark grey colour, and it had a big flange going all the way around. I could see arms sticking out of this flange with what I took to be blades on the top. As I stood here, there was 2 balls came out, 2 balls. I think they'd be about 3 feet in diameter with about 6 spikes. And they were rolling on these spikes. And they came right up beside me. And I remember feeling a tug at that time. A very powerful smell, a choking sort of smell. And that was it.
He came to after what was later estimated as a 15 to 20 minute interval, and heard what he described as the sound of something moving very fast away in the distance. Bob was face down in the grass, his clothing was ripped, and he felt pains in his head, legs and throat. A strange, cloying, bitter taste lingered in his mouth. The object was gone, and Lara the dog was running around, absolutely frantic. At this point, Bob was experiencing weakness, vertigo, and for the first few minutes anyway, extreme difficulty walking. possibly because his balls had just been replaced by spiked metal spheres.
Off balance, having to readjust.
So he dragged himself back to his truck and tried to drive himself home, but in shock, he ended up crashing straight into a ditch. He was forced to travel the last mile home on foot. He arrived home in a state of distress and was greeted by his stoical wife. Now, I'm going to play for you here, Mike, a short section of an interview with the wife, because I think it's the most stereotypically Scottish reaction to an alien abduction that I can even imagine.
It looked terrible when he came in the door, and he just stood at the door, and I said, "Have you had an accident with your lorry?" And he said, "No, I've been attacked." And I said, "What with?" And he said, "A spaceship." And I said, "Oh, goodness me, there's no such a thing as a spaceship. I'm going to phone the doctor. You must have fell and hurt your head." He looked quite shocked, and he was drained. He was right white, and his face was dirty, and he had a red scar here. And his clothes were all dirty, and his trousers. And then he told me his trousers had been torn.
Your trousers have been torn?
I've watched that before.
Yeah, it's a famous clip, but I love her take on it. Because that's just what your Scottish granny would say if you had just been abducted by aliens and probed up the arse. With a 15-foot probe, you come in and it's like, "I've just been assaulted by a spaceship." There's no such a thing as a spaceship.
There's no such thing as a spaceship, son. Boy's head's full of broken glass.
Brilliant. Yeah, I love that. I love that.
It's great.
That just gives it the total ring of truth.
Yeah.
So, at this point, the police were contacted, and Robert Taylor was also visited by his doctor and his manager at Livingston Development Corporation, Malcolm Drummond. He told his visitors that he believed he'd been gassed by something, and under the orders of his doctor, Taylor briefly attended hospital, but rather frustratingly, in terms of building up an evidentiary case, he then discharged himself before he was properly examined. He continued to suffer from headaches and thirst for 2 days after the incident, but eventually his health returned to normal and he experienced no further ill effects, apart from a slight clanking when he walked.
I know, jokes aside, Jesus, poor Bob.
I know. He seems very, very genuine about it.
Yeah.
He is almost embarrassed to be interviewed.
Yeah.
He's frightened to be back in the plate. You know, you can tell just by looking at him that is a man who's experienced something way outside of his normal day-to-day experience. Unusually for a case involving claims of unknown objects and strange phenomena, the local police actually took a keen interest in the events of 9th November. Now, part of that likely is because, as we've said, Bob was a very, very stoic, down-to-earth, no-nonsense kind of guy who had no interest in publicity whatsoever. He genuinely seemed to have been attacked by someone or something. They remained agnostic to the question of an alien vessel, but they approached the case as a common assault by someone or something unknown. And it's for this reason that the Dechmont Woods encounter is sometimes labelled as the only example of a UFO encounter becoming the subject of a criminal investigation. Now, I don't know if that's actually true or if it remains the case, but it's certainly been promoted as such and continues to be by ufologists. Malcolm Drummond, Bob Taylor's boss, accompanied police officers to the clearing where Bob claimed to have encountered the object. There, exactly where the object was claimed to have been resting or hovering potentially, they found what they described as ladder-shaped impressions in the soft soil, as well as trails of small, shallow holes that could have been the work of the so-called sea mines that Bob claimed had rolled and bounced towards him. The police considered that the ladder-like marks could have been left by a bulldozer of some kind with caterpillar tracks, but what was strange about them was that these tracks were only found and only visible at the point where the strange object was said to have been positioned. There was no sign of any similar tracks elsewhere in the clearing, despite it all being soft ground. There was no sign on the access road, there was no signs of tracks coming or going through the surrounding woods, which seemed to suggest that whatever left those tracks had somehow not been touching the ground on both its way in and out of the clearing. Detective Sergeant Tan Work, which he may well have been an alien himself, Michael, with a name like that.
Whoa. Sorry, say that name again.
Tan Work.
Tan Work.
Work, like Kirsty Work.
Yeah, Tan Work. That's definitely. There's nothing to see here. Everything is fine, human.
So Detective Sergeant Flibble Skywalker went so far as to... Tan Work went so far as to check the tracks of all forestry equipment used by the Livingston Development Corporation and other companies in the area, and found nothing that remotely matched the tracks in the clearing. He also checked civil aviation records for helicopter traffic in the vicinity to see if anything could have been lifting objects into or out of the clearing, and came up with nothing. He said, "In my opinion, Mr. Taylor genuinely reported what he saw or what he believed he had seen. The police report itself stated, the marks indicated an object of several tons had stood there, but no information has been gained to explain them." Now, I know you're all wondering about Bob's ripped trousers. So, Bob's ripped trousers, and that's another band name, Mike.
Oh, 100%.
Were examined by the police's own forensic scientists and later by a ufology group called Strange Phenomena Investigations Scotland. Both concluded, similarly, that the heavy serge fabric of the garments had been ripped by some sort of upward mechanical force, although they couldn't conclusively show that anything out of the ordinary was involved in that. The torn trousers are now held in the archive of Bufora, the British UFO Research Association, and I like to imagine they've got these old breeks hanging in some kind of grand glass display cabinet or something like that.
And in every Christmas party, they take them down, everyone just tries them on. Walks about in them.
What are these brown stains up the back? Well, you got a terrible fright when...
Aye.
So what was it? What went on that morning in that clearing just off the M8 motorway? A place where you and I have probably been within a few hundred meters of many, many times in our lives. The classical ufological extraterrestrial hypothesis is that Robert Taylor encountered some kind of alien vessel or unmanned probe that then incapacitated him for whatever reason. Now, I'm not saying I particularly believe that, but there are a few unusual characteristics to the case that I find particularly interesting. And in some ways, I think that actually improves the credibility of the story. When people invent tall tales, even if we imagine that he did make up the story, when people come up with these tales, 99% of the time they tend to draw upon well-established tropes for their story, right? So if you ask the average person on the street, especially someone who's not interested in UFO lore, which by all accounts he wasn't, he had no interest in it, never really had talked about it, they would probably come up with the same sort of, same certain tropes, same well-established elements. They might say, oh, they saw lights in the sky, there was little grey men with big heads, a big saucer-shaped disc, that kind of thing. This really doesn't go along with the expected tropes at all. You've got a very bizarre object that can only loosely be described as a UFO. It may not even have been flying at all. It might have just been sitting in the clearing. You've got these strange mechanical spheres that behave sort of as if they were alive, or perhaps operating by remote control or autonomously. You've got a victim not knocked out by some mystical sky beam, but apparently by a very material vapour or gas. There are apparently no flesh and blood extraterrestrials seen at all. And it all feels both a lot more down to earth and a lot more genuinely strange and bizarre than your average UFO claim. You know what I mean? I think that does make it more...
Yeah, I think the fact, like you say, that it doesn't have the sort of standard alien encounter, and the fact that, as you said before, it's like he basically walks into a field and then all of a sudden just sees a UFO.
Boom. Yeah.
The sea mines, as he called them. I wonder if he served during the war, or what age was he?
He did. He did. He was born in 1919, and some of the other people that have been interviewed about him describe him as a war hero. He fought in World War II. He was known locally as a war hero.
So I wondered that just because that was his interpretation of
point
it.
Of reference.
And I always find it fascinating that with kind of anomalous experiences, you try to like graft onto that experience what your kind of codex is already in your head, like what your interpretive experiences and language is to just understand and quantify something. And sometimes it doesn't even need to be something paranormal, or there are times where our brains just don't quite work and we think we're looking at something and we can't quite grasp what it is for a second. And in these situations, sometimes you can be so far off the reality of what it actually is that's happening. And the fact that he lost consciousness as well, didn't he?
He did. We'll come to this in a little bit, but that's quite astute. That's a really good point. You're right. Like, it's that whole thing where some people have proposed that old stories from past centuries where people have claimed, folkloric stories where people have claimed to have been taken away by the little people, by fairies, were that sort of generation's interpretation of a phenomena that people now might interpret as being aliens. Like, because if little people came and abducted you now, people's point of reference would be aliens. Whereas 500 years ago or 600 years ago, people would be like, it was elves, it was fairies, So you're right, people...
Angels in the sky.
So, people look at these things through the lens of the culture that they were raised in. So that's a great point. But it is odd because sort of connected to that, he doesn't really make any claims of the object flying in the sky. He doesn't embellish anything, really. He's very, very matter of fact about what he saw, almost kind of dry in his description of it all, which actually, to the extent that he's so dry and so to the point, you almost wonder what is it about this specifically that even leads us to alien technology as an explanation, because when you boil it all down, all that's actually described is some unusual machinery in a clearing.
And if he's seen action during the Second World War, there are things that you have an experience that can seem sort of earth-shattering to you at the time, but future experiences don't live up to it. They don't have the same impact anymore because you've kind of broken through the ceiling of experience with that. So, like, if he's seen terrible things during the war, especially if by all accounts it sounds like he was maybe in the Navy, I don't know, but if he's talking about sea mines and things like that, which is, that's all fascinating because, of course, you could just use that to say that's what he was having some sort of strange flashback, But
that's the point, actually, What I was kind of getting at there is, if most of the time people, especially in the trauma of these kind of shocking situations, there's a temptation, even unconscious, people don't know they're doing it, to slightly embellish stories in their memory when they're looking back on it to try and better fit the template of the time, to try and make it better fit, say, like what a UFO abduction should be like. To go, maybe I did get a glimpse of like a little grey man, I can't quite remember, Whereas it's almost like from the descriptions and the kind of descriptions of what Robert Taylor was like as a man and his background, it's almost like here you are getting the actual, like, just the facts. And I think that's part of what makes this although you're right, like, it is arguable that certain aspects have been informed by his history. He just does seem very clear and very straightforward and to the point. And it's like maybe this is a clearer glimpse than we normally get of this kind of thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's just it kind of reminds me, not to make this all about me again, ladies and gentlemen.
Go on.
It reminds me of my granddad, who I never met, but who fought during the First World War, and he was at the Battle of the Somme, which is one of the worst moments in probably human military history. But I always remember my dad talking about, my granddad had done and seen unbelievable things. He'd had to shoot someone he knew caught in barbed wire. He was buried for 3 days during the Second World War. He tried to join up again. He went down to a training place and a munitions barracks went up, and he was buried for 3 days. And then even after the war, like, he owned a horse, and his horse was ill and needed to be put down. And I can't remember the name of them, but there were guys that at that time actually, their job was
knackers.
Aye, that's it.
I know that because those were the guys that Terrare used to befriend. Right. And that other guy, what was his name again? I forget the other French guy that used to eat horrible things. My
granddad, by all accounts, was very, very much loved animals, and this guy turns up to put it's like basically almost like a gun that shoots a bolt into the head of the animal, and he saw that the guy's hand was shaking for some reason. The guy's hand was shaking, and he took it off and he killed his own horse.
Jesus.
Because he didn't want the animal to suffer if the guy's hand was shaking, and he didn't do it right, you know?
Yeah.
But the reason I'm mentioning all that is that all of these really, really incredible things that happened in his life, only once did my dad ever see him emotional. About something, which was when my gran had a heart attack. She didn't die, but she had a heart attack, and she was taken to hospital, and he walked out into his garden, and my dad saw him, and he was crying.
Yeah.
You know, it was the only time that he'd ever seen him. This is a weird tangent, but my point is that someone like that, who has been through the war, had all these sorts of experiences that we can't even sort of imagine, they can, for most other experiences, maintain this. It's not apathy, but it is almost kind
stoicism.
of... Yeah, that's it perfectly. So it was a long way to say that, ladies and gentlemen. There you go. So maybe it seems ridiculous if he's talking about the UFO in such sort of plain terms.
Yeah.
And for us, we'd be like, holy shit. But for him, he might just be like, I've been in a ship that was torpedoed.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. No, that's a really great point. But yeah, you know, like, because of that, it feels a lot more down to earth and a lot more strange and a lot more bizarre, because it doesn't even fit in with the well-established UFO lore. It's sort of like its own thing, almost. You know, what could account for that? You know, aliens shouldn't be the first thing we consider, and like I say, there's nothing conclusively about this that even if his story is true, it would have to be aliens. He saw some machinery in a clearing that behaved in a weird way, but, you know, he didn't see any kind of alien beings or anything like that. So what else could account for that? Well, a number of people involved in the case, including Malcolm Drummond, Bob's boss, who, as I said, inspected the site along with police officers on the day of the encounter, were of the opinion that some kind of unusual or secretive human device was responsible for what Bob experienced. Drummond said, "There is no doubt in my mind that these marks were made by a perfectly solid, heavier-than-air object. They'd been made by some machine which had come down vertically. I don't believe in anything from outer space. The only conclusion I can come to is that there must have been a man-made object, some sort of secret machine belonging to one of the government departments." So was it some kind of prototype UAV? It's possible. Such things kind of did exist at the time. And there have been some theories that what he actually saw was a prototype UAV being decommissioned by a type of bomb disposal device that later came to be commonly seen in Northern Ireland. You know, one of the robotic bomb disposal machines. It's possible, but the thing with that is, if it was a secret device, particularly a secret flying device, why would a government agency be operating something like that? A stone's throw from the busiest motorway in Scotland, on public land, next to a common walking area that's frequented by lots of people. It doesn't really make sense either. Yeah,
when you live in a country like Scotland where there's plenty of room to go to places where almost no one's going to see what's going on.
Yeah, there's big chunks of up north where there's MOD land, Ministry of Defence land, and they could do what they want there and no one would see it. Why would they be doing it next to M8? It doesn't make... I mean, it's possible. Maybe it came down there accidentally, but it doesn't quite ring true either. Another attempted explanation put forth by skeptic Stuart Campbell is that the large object Bob saw was a mirage of the planet Venus, and the small sea mine objects were like a split mirage of the planet Mercury. Now, that sounds absolutely laughable, and frankly, it is.
Unbelievable. In a field.
Yeah, he didn't describe like moving lights in the sky, however unusual. He described solid objects on the ground, you know, some in contact.
Swamp gas.
Yeah, like some in contact with his body. Like how, obviously you can get crazy effects in the sky with like temperature inversions and mirages and stuff, but this is like below the tree line in the field with him. It doesn't make sense. Well, to give Campbell his due, there are some additional elements to his theory that are a bit more credible than the mirage thing, and actually stand alone a lot better without the tortured Venus mirage than they do with it. He hypothesized that Taylor additionally, and I would suggest without any mirage or any of that nonsense, suffered an epileptic fit. He thought he suffered the epileptic fit on seeing the Venus mirage, which, just seems like an unnecessary convolution, to be quite honest. And he thought that the fit then triggered, his perception of the event. Now, the reason that he's used the mirage theory is that astronomical mirages are Campbell's pet blanket explanation for everything. He's written a book on the subject. That's not to say they don't account for some sightings sometimes. I certainly believe they do. And he's right to point out that most people don't know all the kinds of tricks that the atmosphere can play, but from looking over his writings on the subject, I feel like he has a real bias towards trying to crowbar the mirage explanation in wherever he can. The rest of his theory doesn't need it. I don't know why he's included it in the theory.
Yeah. It's a way to make your mark, isn't it? To be like, I'm the guy that came up with the solution.
Buy my book.
To why people are seeing UFOs.
Yeah.
It's always a planetary mirage.
Yeah, well, that's essentially it. But this idea of like a neurological episode, an epileptic seizure, or even a mini stroke, a transient ischemic attack, as suggested by local investigator Phil Fenton, that isn't completely without merit. These types of episodes can and do cause hallucinations, according to the paper Delusions, Illusions and Hallucinations in Epilepsy, published in Epilepsy Research by doctors Brent Elliott, Eileen Joyce and Simon Shorvin. Epileptic seizures in particular can commonly manifest in, quote, experiential and interpretative phenomena, affective symptoms, auditory, olfactory, gustatory, somatic and visual hallucinatory phenomena, several of which are found in the story Bob gave. Additionally, not too far from the supposed site of the encounter is another clearing. I believe it may actually be maybe on the other side of the motorway or a little bit further away from the motorway, but there's another clearing with a large, low-to-the-ground, dome-shaped water tower. Is it possible that Bob was already in some sort of prodrome to this attack and in his slight confusion arrived at the wrong place and, in a semi-confused state, saw the unexpected water tower where he wasn't expecting to see any water tower because he thinks he's in the different clearing, and then has hallucinated everything else before he's passed out, and the water tower's been kind of incorporated into the hallucinations as this, because it does have sort of a brim round it that it could be taken as this flange. It's not perfect, like it doesn't stand on stilts, it doesn't have like propellers and things on it. It's not made of grey metal, but it could be, you kind of squint and think it could, that could be the seed of something. It's possible that there is something particularly feverish, something psychedelic even about the events and sites described. However down to earth the language in which he puts it, there is something psychedelic or spacey about what's described. Bob Taylor didn't have a history of epilepsy or ischemic issues, but then one-off events do happen to people, and someone who's never experienced one of those before is less likely to know it for what it is when it happens, I guess. I mean, who knows? What I am sure of, though, is that whether what he encountered was extraterrestrial or not, whether it was a real thing or whether it was some kind of sensory or epileptic hallucination, Bob Taylor genuinely believed in what he saw. This guy, he wasn't a fame seeker. He was, if anything, embarrassed and frustrated by the attention his encounter brought him. He never gained financially from his story. He never made any attempt to do so. And his story never changed, even as he sought to withdraw from the attention it brought him. Everyone who knew Taylor said that he was an extremely reserved, straight-laced, down-to-earth man, and you get that impression from the interviews with him on the Arthur C. Clarke show that we had excerpts from earlier. He almost like he doesn't really want to be interviewed, but not in a kind of shifty way. He just seems like he's a bit scared, a bit out of his element, and a bit sort of confused about what's happened and genuinely disturbed by it. It just really does seem genuine, and I don't always place a lot of stock in just the vibe I get from someone. But the whole picture here does seem to suggest he deeply believed in what he saw.
Yeah, in today's social media atmosphere where people are always striving for attention. It's maybe difficult for people to understand that there are people who just really, really feel uncomfortable with attention.
You don't want the attention. Yeah.
Maybe it's kind of that with him. But again, that would add credence to the idea that, well, he's not telling this story because he wants attention. That's the last thing he wants.
Yeah,
he's
precisely.
telling it because he's so confused and bewildered by it.
Yeah, absolutely. He wanted answers. That was the only reason he spoke about it. He didn't want attention. He just wanted someone to tell him what it was. Bob Taylor passed away 14 years ago now, 2007. He was a widower at the age of 88. He went to his grave absolutely adamant that he was telling the truth about what he'd seen. So yeah, it's a strange case.
It is really interesting because it's a little bit out of the ordinary. There's no kind of Hollywood pizzazz to it. The only thing that I could think about when he was describing the kind of sea mine part of it.
Yeah.
In science fiction, you do have, little probes breaking off from alien ships, and
Yeah.
it made me think of Phantasm.
Yeah, actually, that's a point. Yeah. Maybe Sputnik as well.
Yeah. The original War of the Worlds, there are, kind of tentacled things that come out of the mechanical, tripod-esque looking ships and things like that. But this is the thing with a case like this, it's so easy to just dismiss it and say, well, it was A, B or C, when really, and I know you have to say that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, but it's so easy to just sort of brush these things under the carpet. But this is an interesting case because it's not one that feels that it's for the attention, nor is it one that necessarily feels like it's coming from a person who's unstable or maybe prone to mental health issues. I mean, you don't know. No. Maybe he was, but if he doesn't appear that way, sometimes you read a fascinating encounter with a UFO or some other anomalous phenomena, and then you see an interview with the person and you go, and you might read it and you might be like, oh, this is fascinating, and then you see an interview with the person and you think, oh,
they're full of shit.
Oh no. Oh no.
Yeah.
Quite often just that you're like, nah, they're kind of living in a fantasy land.
Yeah.
What's a shame about that is that maybe there are instances where the person's telling the truth, but they're also someone who's prone to fantastical kind of indulgences,
Yeah. What I find interesting about this is that it kind of plays into a little kind of thought experiment I often pose, is that if you imagine that as astronomers and people who take a serious academic interest in the search for extraterrestrial life would assert that essentially the whole of ufology and the kind of established tropes of alien visitation to Earth are basically false. They're either the result of hoaxes, they're a result of, misidentifications, of neurological problems, of mythology, all interweaving together and creating this milieu of mythology and urban legend that has sort of taken on a life of its own. That would be how a serious academic researcher would tend to characterize, the UFO extraterrestrial hypothesis. They would say, we're not really been visited by aliens. Aliens might exist out there, but there's no evidence that they've ever come here, right? If we take that, if we imagine that that's basically true, just for the purpose of argument, right? Let's imagine that that's basically true, that the whole story about grey aliens and all that, it's all just varying types of bullshit, varying types of, mistaken identity, various types of hoaxes. Imagine that we were visited once, in amongst all that, there was one alien probe landed on Earth. It happened, and someone came and said, oh my god, something came out of the sky and landed. I've never seen anything like it before. It did X, Y, Z. It was really weird, and then it flew away. That could happen, and then people will be like, yeah, it's just another UFO story. It's a load of shit, right? It could happen once, or twice, or a few times in amongst all the bullshit.
And maybe it happened to Bob's Buzz.
Well, this is what I'm saying. Like, you would expect then that to be a story that stood out from all the others, because it wouldn't be one that would necessarily adhere to all the tropes that built up from the fake stories. It would be its own thing. It would be different enough that it wouldn't resemble those necessarily. This is that kind of story. You know, I almost feel like this could be the one instance that an alien probe landed on Earth. If there's just one event where a UFO genuinely landed on Earth, and it only ever happened once in the last century, this could be it. It's different enough that it could be it, you know? So, not saying I think it is, but just in terms of that thought experiment, this is the kind of thing that could be like that.
And we would miss it.
Yeah, we would miss it because of all the other stuff, all the hoaxes. Well, guys, I hope you have all enjoyed this in lieu of our usual full-length Talking Till Dawn episodes. Normal service, I think, will resume pretty soon.
Yes.
Well, thank you all for listening, and thank you for your continued support, and we'll be back with you, both of us, before you know it. In the meantime, keep your spiked balls rolling.
And I think the sun's coming up.
Oh yeah, and the sun is coming up. Bye!
Yeah. And whatever your bullshit is, Michael. Yeah, bye.